talking to me? You talking to me?
So today I am talking to you, and we want to talk about strategies for effective communication with students. And I'm actually gonna turn this thing off. No, I'm not. Okay. So a quick outline of the topics that we will cover in today's webinar. We will talk about a communication plan for you and your students, what you can do to prepare your students to make the most out of this new environment. We'll briefly talk about ways to communicate in both real-time synchronous and asynchronous settings. And then we'll also talk a little bit about what you can do in terms of sharing and annotating files with your students. So in terms of a communication plan, one of the most important things is we invite you to consider your goals and your expectations. Now, this is both pedagogical goals as well as communication goals. And one thing to keep in mind when we talk about communication, it's both communication about your course, but also communication in your course. So those are two things that we want you to think about as you come up with a communication plan and when you set expectations for your students. Think about what is realistically achievable in terms of going through your syllabus and your lessons. What do you need to adjust? And then if you make any adjustments to your syllabus, to your schedule, just make sure you communicate that very clearly with your students. For your personal communication goals, one thing we can't stress enough is make sure that you let your students know what your responsiveness will be and what your availability will be in terms of them reaching out to you. There is no expectation that you will reply to every email you receive or every inquiry you get from a student within an hour. I think a lot of people, now that they find themselves sitting at home, you are so much more plugged in. You might have your email open all the time. You might be on your phone at the same time. You might check social media. So I think it's just messages keep coming in at rapid speed. Make sure you schedule time for yourself. Make sure you schedule off-screen time and encourage your students to do the same. And just be very clear how often you check email and what your availability is to get back to students. So again, there is no expectation that you will respond immediately, and make sure that your students are aware of that. So in your goal setting and in your expectations and communication, be realistic. Don't try to achieve the unachievable right now. This is an unprecedented situation, and I think first and foremost, we all need to take care of ourselves and make sure that we are healthy, make sure that our students are doing well. So don't try to cram in everything that might still be on your syllabus, and just make sure that you communicate that with your students. Also be very explicit, going back to stating what your response time is when you are available for students outside of synchronously scheduled times on Zoom or on Canvas. The more clear you can be with your expectations, with your goals, with what is going to happen any given day in class, the easier you will make it for your students. So when usually you would maybe write down directions on the board, or you would share something in a PowerPoint slide, make sure you still do that, but share that in multiple ways so students really know what's going on and what's to be expected. Because we don't have that physical face-to-face, oh, hey, teacher, I have a quick question, right? We unfortunately are missing that in this new remote environment. So one suggestion that we have for your communication plan, consider coming up with a daily or weekly email preview. Or if you don't use email, you could utilize the announcements on Canvas, or you can create a one-page just very specifically laying out, okay, these are the 3 goals for the day or for the week. This is how we're going to get there. So think about what are we going to do in class? What are the goals? Articulate why. Why are we doing this? That's tied to what is the ultimate goal? Where can students find the information or the task or additional resources? When is something due, especially if you have an assessment tied to something? And so just make sure that you are very explicit and very clear, because sometimes, again, if students by accident drop out of a Zoom call, it might take a second to get back in, and then they're lost. They have lost the chat that was going on. So just the more explicit you can be, the more at ease you will put your students. When you are in Zoom, think about how you are going to what's called passing the virtual microphone. So think about what will you do so that students don't all talk over each other. Again, I think in the language classes, we are in a fortunate situation where we have rather small groups. So it should be fairly easy to structure that, and you already have something that works in your regular face-to-face class. Very likely you can simply call on students and ask them to unmute their microphone, and then they can respond to whatever task you want them to respond to. But something else that you could do, especially when you do breakout rooms in Zoom and you want students to report back, number the groups, give the group room names, and then go room by room and ask the students within their groups to assign certain roles to the students. So for example, one student can be the manager, one student can be the secretary who takes notes, one student can be the speaker who then reports out on behalf of the school, of the group. One student can be the researcher, right? Depending on how many students you have in a group. But as long as whenever you have reporting out from a group, you put it on the students to figure out who the person is who will speak on behalf of the group. That will help manage group sizes and manage the classroom that way. A few things real quick. You have seen this email very likely already, but we just wanted to point this out again and make sure that you build that into your communication plan with the students. We've had changes to the schedule for prelims. So let your students know in advance about any revisions that you are making. Give them updates, let them know what changes there are to how you plan to assess them. And again, I think this goes back to the point of simply being explicit and communicating with your students. There is somewhat a little bit of leeway in terms of timing for all of this. Keep in mind if students have certain accommodations, if they need more time. So what you shouldn't do, and we will talk about this more on Friday in the webinar on assessment, you shouldn't just make a quiz open that's your final exam on Canvas for the duration of a regular class session. Again, we need to keep in mind that students may be in different time zones, and if your class starts at 8, 3 hours earlier, students may not be up on the West Coast. So you need to rethink how you assess and what you will do. And I think, again, in the languages, we are in a fortunate situation that usually not 70% of the final grade is a final paper or a project, at least in the lower level language courses. So very likely your assessment strategy will work, but just keep that in mind and join us on Friday as we talk more about assessment. The email that went out also included this new alternative prelim schedule, and we just wanted to throw that in here again in case you haven't seen that email yet. So make sure that you adjust your course schedule accordingly, because we extended the semester by 1 week. So what can you do to prepare your students and to help them succeed in this new remote environment? One thing, if you haven't already done that, we highly encourage that you survey your students. We all had to respond to the survey from our college about our readiness to teach online. And so some things to consider when you survey your students is verify what time zone that you're in so you know which students may or may not be able to join you for synchronous sessions. Ask them about their internet access. Do they have high-speed Wi-Fi? Do they only have a data plan on their cell phone? Is the cell phone the only hardware? How would they connect to your class? because that can also have some impact on how you make your materials available to make sure that all students have access to everything. So we created a Qualtrics survey with a whole bunch of questions that will get at exactly what place, what physical space are the students in, to help you gauge how you might need to adjust your pedagogical materials. That survey comes from colleagues at Rutgers University. If you are interested in seeing that survey or in using it, let us know, send us an email, and we will make you a collaborator on that Qualtrics survey, so you can copy it into your own Qualtrics and then simply share it with students. Or you can take the questions, send them out via email, put them in a different survey format. But this is one thing that I think will help you understand where the students are, and then tailor your teaching and your approach to the situation of your students. Something else that we keep reiterating in our webinars here is teach your students how to navigate and how to learn in this new online environment. So we shouldn't assume that because our students are supposedly these digital natives and they were basically born with a cell phone in their hand, that they will know how to navigate this space. On the first day, don't just jump right back in. Do a wellness check first. Talk to the students. They will be so delighted to hear your voice, to see your picture, to see your face. And then take some time to show them the functionality of the tools that you are using and practice with them. In Zoom, practice all the different features of hand raising, of muting their microphone, of turning on and off the video camera, depending on how you're going to use that. Maybe throw in a quick poll, put them in a breakout room. So don't start right away with a high stakes assessment, because the students need to familiarize themselves with this new environment as well. If you are using Canvas now and you haven't used Canvas before, pull that up, share your screen and walk them through, showing them this is where you can find the syllabus, this is where we have announcements, if you use the calendar function. I mean, whatever you use, even if you only use Canvas to park course materials, show the students this is where the materials are housed, and this will help them be a little bit more at ease. One other thing that you can think about, and we will talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the synchronous versus the asynchronous environment, consider sharing some materials about Zoom and Canvas before you start teaching. Of course, this week is spring break and classes have been suspended, so there is no assumption to assign anything, and you actually, as a matter of fact, should not assign any tasks to your students. But it might be a good idea to send your students a quick email in preparation for the first day of class. We've heard from a few students over the last 2.5 weeks, and they're somewhat anxious because they haven't heard anything from their teachers yet, and they're confused about what's going to happen, what will happen on the first day that our classes resume, where am I supposed to go, what am I supposed to do I need to have, a headset ready, what's going to happen? So I think it might be good to be proactive right now and check in with the students. We have created a number of materials on the LRC website. We'll take a look at that at the end here. There is one particular tab for students on our preparedness website. And on that page, we have a number of different cheat sheets, brief one-page overview introductions for what does Zoom look like? What do all these buttons on the bottom mean? There is also a video demonstration of a Zoom class where we describe to the students, this is what it looks like when you get put into a breakout room. This is what it looks like when your teacher does a poll. So they can kind of see a live class, Zoom class in action. And then most importantly, we created a document with tips for succeeding as a student in this new environment that will walk them through the very basics, and we'll get to that in more detail in a moment here. So again, the information for the students is linked off of our LRC preparedness page, but in this presentation, and we will post the slides on that preparedness page after the webinar today, there is a specific Google folder that's titled for students. And again, the one pager that explains the Zoom features, the live demo of a Zoom classroom from the student perspective. And FYI, there is also a live demo of a Zoom room from the teacher perspective. So you can see what actually happens when you create a poll, or what happens when you decide to start the breakout room. So you can see all those features in that live demo, and then that tip sheet on how to succeed as a language learner. So the tip sheet is divided into 3 major target areas for the students. One is organization, then communication, and then time management. And I think a lot of these things we will likely take as very obvious, but I think it doesn't hurt for the students just to read through that quickly and just double check, you know, do I know how to connect my headset? What if I have a laptop that doesn't even have an audio jack? What do I do if I have an old school headset that plugs in through an audio jack? With communication, I think one thing that the way that this current generation communicates, they tend to not see email as a regular channel of communication. And so that's something, if this is a way that you will communicate with the students, make sure that you remind them to check their email on a regular basis. This is also how the university communicates very important information to them, and they really should get into the habit of checking their Cornell email on a regular basis. And then some tips on time management, and again, encouraging the students to also schedule some off-screen time, just as we all need to keep our sanity here. Here is a cute little picture that has been circulating on one of the many websites that, or Facebook groups that I'm on to help prepare for teaching in this new remote environment. So I think if you just want a very quick 4 points to create good online habits, tell your students to remain active, to be steady and reliable, to be resilient, and to also be playful. I think one thing, the approach that we have taken to all of our support here is to try to inject some humor whenever we can. We realize that this is a very serious situation, that this is a very stressful and anxiety-inducing situation, but we have to remember to laugh. That's good for the soul, that's good for the heart. So one thing that we always try in all of our FaceTime, Zoom meetings, whatever meetings they are, is to get a good laugh. So that's something else if you wanted to share this. This is from the Global Online Academy, which is a nonprofit organization that reimagines learning to empower students and to have them be an active participant in their online environment. So a quick note on communication in synchronous and asynchronous ways. So just some ideas of what you can do in terms of language skills, in terms of supporting written work and spoken word. So you can see the table here. So for synchronous work, you can use Google Documents, assuming all of your students are in a country where there is no blockade of Google. If you have students, for example, in China, then you may have to use discussions in Canvas instead, because students may not have access to anything on Google Drive. Students can, of course, practice their language in a written form, in a synchronous manner, in the chat feature in Zoom, and also the whiteboard in Zoom, if that's something that you are planning on using. We will talk about the Zoom features again in tomorrow's webinar. Some thoughts on asynchronous ways for students to practice their writing in the target language. Of course, your traditional essay. And if you assign essays, it might at this point be a good idea to ask students to actually physically write. So take pen and paper, and then they can snap a picture, PDF it directly on their phone, or just send it as an image file to you. Of course, if you do ask them to handwrite, it might be more difficult to read. But we know that handwriting something activates different areas in the brain. And our students will be spending so much time in front of devices right now, not only to watch Tiger King on Netflix, and text with their students on their phones and do their coursework on their laptop. So if we can come up with assignments where students don't have to be actively sitting in front of a laptop, that might be a nice change of pace for them. Of course, there are other asynchronous options with Canvas writing assignments. Google Docs, of course, also works asynchronously. And then other file sharing with documents that students have created themselves offline in an asynchronous time frame. For spoken options, of course, synchronously, you have the Zoom class meetings where students can practice speaking. The breakout rooms are great for that. If you have any questions about that, we're happy to schedule a time with you to show you how that works. Your office hours can happen synchronously where students can ask questions and again, practice the target language. And then depending on what your connection is with the students, I know that some of our colleagues already have WhatsApp groups that they have set up with their students, or they might use FaceTime. Of course, all of that is at your personal discretion. We are not trying to encourage you to share your cell phone number with your students. I, for one, wouldn't want to do that with students that I'm teaching, but there are other online apps where you could replicate a synchronous environment. And if you have any questions about that, let us know. Again, as a reminder, right now is not the time to start adding new tools that you are not familiar with only because you've heard that they're the greatest thing since, I guess, we changed sliced bread now to toilet paper. The greatest thing right now is toilet paper. But if you have questions about any tools, and if you feel confident that you are up for the challenge of adding something new, let us know, and we have a whole list of language specific or tools specific for language learning and teaching that we can recommend to you. To allow your students to practice speaking in an asynchronous fashion, you can have them do voice recordings in different Canvas assignments. So instead of typing an essay, there is a feature where students can record their voice, or also where you can record a listening prompt instead of having everything be reading and writing based. If students have mobile devices, of course, they can record that way and upload things. And then here are 3 apps that are great for asynchronous speaking, and also have the option to create community by including video if students are interested, and those are Voicethread, Flipgrid, and Marco Polo. If you have any questions about those, we can take those offline after this webinar is done. We already talked about some of the advantages and challenges of synchronous and asynchronous environments. Here is another consolidated quick overview in case you haven't participated in one of our earlier webinars. So of course, the advantages of a synchronous time with your students is that there is immediate personal engagement. You really foster a feeling of community, and that's very important right now because a lot of our students do feel isolated. The conversations we've had with students so far, not only is it stressful and an anxiety-inducing situation, but they do feel lonely depending on where they are. They might be in a situation where they really don't want to be in, but they had to move back with their parents. So our class time with our students might actually be a safe haven for them. When you are real time with your students, of course, there is a much more responsive exchange. Students can quickly ask a question, and that can help prevent miscommunication or misunderstanding. So on the flip side, some of the challenges, of course, is timing, scheduling, and some technical challenges that you just need to be mindful of and be ready to deal with, or know where to find help. Advantages of asynchronous environments: you have much more flexibility in time and pace. So if you make some of your presentations available before the class, so that's the flipped teaching model, students can review those videos time and time again. They can go back, they can refer back to it at any point in time. Making your materials available in such a manner is much more accessible because students can review archived materials. And it can also lead to increased cognitive engagement because students will have more time to engage with the materials and explore those materials. Whether or not they will is, of course, a different question, but at least the materials are there for the foreseeable future. Some of the challenges in these asynchronous environments, of course, is that you don't have real-time social interaction. and you really can't ask quick questions. And that can be really tricky if you just want a quick clarification. So as you think about retooling your syllabus for the remainder of the semester, think about what are some of the things that really have to happen in the synchronous environment. And of course, I mean, in languages, the natural thing is to have your students practice target language use with one another and with you. But then also think about what are some things that maybe you can move into this asynchronous environment so that students have more processing time and a little bit more flexibility as well. We wanted to also briefly talk about sharing and annotating files in terms of your communication strategy. So we already stressed the importance of accessibility and multimodal learning. Share your materials in as many ways as you can with your students. We talked about this weekly preview of whatever form that may take so that students know what is going to be expected of me in this particular language course for this particular week or lesson. If you do have video recordings, share them with the students for review. If you usually structure your teaching with some kind of a presentation, some kind of slides, think about making them available as a PDF on Canvas or via email before you meet synchronously. Especially if you give specific tasks during a breakout room. When you share your screen, that will go away when you enter a breakout room. So your students may forget what they're supposed to do once they're in the breakout room. You have one option of broadcasting a message in breakout rooms, but that will disappear after a few seconds. So if you don't want to share all of your slides ahead of time because then students read ahead and they don't pay attention, that's understandable, but maybe take all the tasks that will happen in breakout rooms, make a PDF of that, share that ahead of time, and then tell the students when you guys go into the breakout room, make sure you have Canvas open as well, and look at slide number 14 for the task that you are supposed to do right now. Similarly, if you have more extensive lecture notes and you are willing to share those with your students afterwards so that they can go back and read up some more on something that has happened. And again, I don't think that necessarily applies to language classes, but if you think about some of the large lecture classes, that would be very beneficial for students to see the lecture notes of their faculty member. And then also if you have any additional external materials that relate to whatever you are talking about in your lessons, share those with your students. That can take the form of maybe some videos, some listening materials, just other modalities so that students don't only have to learn by going back and reading notes after the fact. Also share via multiple channels. So that could be you send them an email, you post it on Canvas, maybe you have another Google page for your students or something like that. So just think about how your students will be accessing information, and that's why it's so important to talk to them about this so that you know how to best reach your students. You don't have to post it in 15 different locations. If your students all know to go to Canvas, for example, that's perfectly fine. But just try to make your materials available to the students. So we talked about Canvas and email.
And if I
we
can
already
chime in for a second,
Yeah.
Angelika, because it was brought up in the chat that some students, depending on where they've gone home to, may not have access to certain resources or certain methods. Google,
Yes.
or we were talking recently about a student who went home to the United Arab Emirates and Zoom is blocked there. So your students will have additional challenges in some cases, and yeah, we do need to be prepared to circumvent those as much as we're capable of under the circumstances. So if any of your students are unable to access any of our resources, for instance, on Google, just
Correct.
let us know, and you're welcome to share those however you like. They're meant to be shared and used.
Yeah, so I mean, one easy thing, if you have a document on Google Drive, you can download that as a Word document and then email it to a student. So I think if you have students who are in countries where there are certain restrictions, email really will be most important. So I can't stress enough how important it is that we make sure that we encourage our students to check their email on a regular basis. That will just be really, for many instances, the #1 way of communication. And again, central administration, that's how they communicate to the students as well. So we did already talk a little bit about Zoom recordings before we even started this webinar. If there are new and important pieces of information that are shared, and not all of your students are present, you are supposed to record your Zoom sessions and then make them available to the students. There are other screen capture programs that you can utilize if, for example, you plan on creating some videos ahead of time, and then sharing that with your students. Again, if you've never done something like that and you are not that familiar and that comfortable with online technologies, now is not the time to dabble with that. So just make do with the synchronous times that you have on Zoom. But if you have any questions about other screen capture programs, let us know. So one other quick note on annotating files. It's always helpful if you provide your students with feedback, of course. We will talk about that in the webinar on Friday when we talk about assessment as well. But there are different ways of how you can provide more notes. So for example, if you have actual handwritten lecture notes, you can take an image of that, and then in PDF you could add notes to explain something, or in a Word document, you can add a comment that your students can see. Of course, in Google, you can do the same thing. But just think about some of the materials that you have readily available, like, for example, this particular presentation. Some of the bullets might not be enough for a student or one of our colleagues going back after the fact without actually listening to my explanation. So when you do share materials and you think you may need a little bit more, just keep in mind what else you need to provide your students to make sure that they can make sense of how your brain functions, right? I think anytime I've taught an online class for many, many years, and many times to me, the way that I structured my lectures was so obvious. I mean, it made so much sense. And then at one point, a student came to me and they're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so in talking with the student and getting their perspective of how they approach the materials that I make available online, and that particular class was completely asynchronous. So it was more almost like a MOOC, an open online course. That was important feedback for me to kind of rethink how I structure lessons and how I make material available after the fact. So before we take questions, just a couple of reminders. Check in with your students on a regular basis. Be explicit in your communication. Do wellness checks if students are not in class. If you are using Canvas, you can very easily see when a student has been logged on the last time, how much time they spend. And if you notice that students haven't logged on, reach out to them in a different channel, send them an email and just check in and make sure they're okay. Be kind to yourself and to your students. Be flexible, available, compassionate, and understanding, and keep breathing, right? So our preparedness page at the LRC is changing on a regular basis. On the left-hand side, you will see that we added the For Students tab, so you can direct your students directly there with more information. We always upload the webinar slides on here, the webinar recordings. And this is really a growing resource as we find more best practices and as we hear from other institutions on what they are doing. And hopefully in your synchronous class sessions, you will not be the only one talking here, or you will not be the only one in your Zoom room. But at this point, we are happy to take any questions that you all may have.